Fulfill Radio, a voice you can trust. Broadcasting Live presents Two Guys and a Bible with Don Preston and William Bell. Join us each week at 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central as we bring you exciting, sound, challenging, and comforting messages regarding the end times. Thank you for tuning in today. Don Preston is the founder of Preterist Research Institute, or PRI. Don is a prolific author, having written and published 19 books, a host of audio and DVD studies, and is a debater and defender of the full preterist view. His websites are BibleProphecy.com, Eschatology.org, and DonKPreston.com. William Bell is the founder of AllThingsFulfilled.com Ministries and has a website bearing the same name, and has authored 3 books, audios, and DVDs. He has published hundreds of articles and recordings. And now, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Two Guys and a Bible broadcast with Don Preston and William Bell. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Two Guys and a Bible right here on Fulfill Radio, a voice you can trust. I am William Bell, and with me is Don Preston. Don, how are you doing today? And thank you for getting in to the show today. I don't know what happened, but you...
Well, I was pulling a William Bell.
I see. You've been doing that quite well lately.
Yeah, I have. I was actually sitting over there doing some studying, and I just happened to realize it's like, wait a minute, whoa, hang on here. So I ran over here to my laptop. I had everything all set up. All I had to do was log on. Well, wouldn't you know it, my computer decided that now was the time to do some updates.
Yep.
And so it kicked me off of Blog Talk Radio 3 times before it ever allowed me in. And so I'm like, well, okay, I kind of blew that. But here I am. I did manage to make it, and I'm glad to be here. And hope you're well. Got to talk to you earlier in the day, and I assume everything is okay. Still, we've had the beginning of a good week. I tell you what, Saturday and Sunday here in southern Oklahoma were some of the most gloriously beautiful spring days that you could ever hope for. And, of course, what made it particularly enjoyable was the fact that Jan and I have been kind of self-quarantined as a result of COVID. And I think Jan's been out of the house 3 times in a month and a half. So she, needless to say, has been stir crazy. So we took the opportunity to get out in the sun and do some yard work together. Now, yard work, I think you know, William, is not my very favorite thing in all this world to do, but it was very enjoyable to get out, trim some trees back, just do some work around the place, and I tell you what, it was very, very pleasant.
Well, good. I did my yard work last week, and it's rained here a few days. Actually, rained today as well, so I'm not necessarily looking forward to any more, but I've managed to get through this week without having to get outside. Let me take that back. On yesterday, we've got a little raised garden in the back, and 2 of them, by the way, and Leora went out and pulled some of the old vines up, and of course that was the invitation for me to go out and do the rest, finish it all up. And so I did do a little bit, but it was light work. So, but other than that, everything is fine. I'm feeling fine, and so looks good. I mean, it's really been nice weather lately for the most part. And, as you said, Sunday afternoon was so beautiful. Of course, I spent it with my nephew, having a conversation with him, but we enjoyed it. We sat out under a shade tree and just had a very good time talking for a few hours.
Well, great. Yeah, that's always enjoyable. Well, I don't think I had mentioned this, but my brother, that is 74 years old, he had major surgery today, and I'm very glad to report that I spoke to his son on the phone just about 30, 40 minutes ago, and my brother came through the operation just fine. You know my brother, it's Gary, And so anyway, he came through the operation just fine. They had to do a bowel resection. They did find some polyps on the interior of his intestines, so that will be sent off for testing. And but the doctor did say that everything actually looked benign, but they won't know, of course, until the pathology report comes back. But I was very pleased with the doctor's report so far.
Well, very good. That sounds real good. Always good to hear people help, improving and positive results from, their medical attention.
Yeah, he's been having trouble with his colon for a good little while now, and he's one of those people that just doesn't hardly go to the doctor. You just nearly have to drag him. So I knew that he had to be in an awful lot of pain for him to go to the doctor to get tested and checked out. And then, he agreed very readily to the operation. It wasn't like, oh no, I don't think I'm going to do this. I'm cool. I'm fine. No, it was like, okay, when do you want to do this? So I knew that he was in an awful lot of pain. I know that he was suffering a lot, and so we'll hope and continue to pray that he continues to improve and recuperates as the doctors seem to think that he will. On a little bit of a change of note, we did receive some rather disturbing news here in Carter County, Oklahoma. We've had our very first fatality from the COVID virus. A relatively young man. I'm sorry, a young woman. A relatively young woman. She had been diagnosed. She had gone through a period of recovery, and so they actually sent her home because she showed no signs of COVID. But then, lo and behold, 2 days after they sent her home, she died. And they're reporting that she had some underlying health issues. So that's rather disturbing, especially considering the fact that Ardmore has started opening back up. Lots and lots of businesses have started to open up again, and and as a matter of fact, if you drive the streets of Ardmore, you would probably wonder if there had been any shutdown at all, because the traffic has been very heavy. And I've commented to Jan, my wife, on a couple of different occasions when I would have to go into town to get some food for us, go to the grocery store, what have you. I've told her, I said, well, if you were actually going on the amount of traffic that's on you would not know that there was a pandemic going on in America at all, certainly not in Ardmore, Oklahoma. So she and I were just commenting a few moments ago that our concern is, with all of the different businesses that are starting to open back up, that we hope that the COVID virus is not just now beginning to make a full invasion of our county, and that by the businesses opening up, that we're going to see a dramatic increase in the infection rate. But we'll wait to see.
Yeah, of course, Memphis is opening up again as well, so not sure what that's going to mean, but, we'll sit back and kind of see how that's going to turn out.
The good thing about this whole thing, and I've been watching an awful lot of news and reading an awful lot of articles. The bad thing about it is this is very serious. The bad news is it's extremely contagious. But the good news is, thankfully, that the survival rate is over 98.6%. The actual mortality rate, and of course you would hope that not anyone would die. The mortality rate with some strains of flu is actually higher than with the COVID. But again, the good news is that the mortality rate with COVID is very, very low. I read one report yesterday that was saying that the actual mortality rate was less than 1%. So that's pretty impressive, and it's pretty optimistic. And we can just hope and pray that that does continue.
Yeah, absolutely. Always good to know what the real stats are compared to, a lot of things that people hear. When they talk about so many of the deaths and focus on that, you never really are able to put that into some type of perspective. But when you look at perspective and then you compare that with, other types of pandemics that have gone on, and even with, the flu, et cetera, you see that, it's not that far out of the norm for a situation like that, even though there's been a lot of, news and information given, whether, it be exaggerated or, underreported. It's just been a lot of information, so it's hard for people to sort their way through all of that until you wait and see, what some of the actual stats are.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Well, anyway, we live. I was talking to a young man on the phone. He was actually my nephew, my brother's son, and of course, he's never seen anything like this. Most of us haven't actually, and so he has an automotive car lot, what they call a note lot, and his business has suffered dramatically. He said, we're just sitting there day in, day out doing a whole lot of nothing. He said, my business is off 60 to 75%. So he said, that's really troublesome. He said, it's really hitting us hard. He said, man, I've never seen anything like that or like this. And I said, well, join the club. I said, not many people have seen anything like this. This is kind of unprecedented unless you go back to the flu pandemic of 1918, in which millions of people died. So I said, we're thankful that we've not seen anything like this, and we just have to hunker down, and we just have to keep going about our business to the very best that we can, taking the precautions that we can, and just being really, really careful.
And I heard a doctor who taught immunology, and he talked about the virus. He said people are, claiming that they're going into the labs and everything, trying to research and trying to find a vaccine for it. He said, this is not rocket science. He said there are people who have recovered from this, and he says, and if they've recovered from it, he said that means that they already have the serum in their bodies, that makes them immune to it. He says, so all they got to do is extract that and do whatever, I can't
and replicate it.
All
yep.
Basically, yes. And he says, and then you got it done. He said he couldn't understand why, all of this talk about it. But, we have to understand the society that we live in, especially the pharmaceutical motivated society, and also some of the other conditions, political situations around all of this. So it's just sad that everybody has to take a hit for this in one way or the other. As you were saying, the financial side of it, as well as other things going on in the world today. But like I said, on the other side of this, I think we'll be able to look back and see what actually took place and how it affects everybody.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mentioned on the program a couple of weeks ago that I think and I said it jestingly, but I said I'm going to work up some T-shirts that says I survived COVID-19, and you watch, somebody's going to do that, William, and they'll make $1 gazillion on it, and I won't. So that's the way that goes. But anyway, so, well, we want to get back to our study of the Messianic Temple. This whole thing, I was on the internet, of course, and I was looking at all of the videos saying that the COVID-19 is an absolute proof positive that we're in the last days, that, the rapture is right around the corner, etc. And one person after another saying, Jesus said there's going to be pestilence, famine, earthquake, etc., and COVID-19 is pestilence, so we're living in the last days. Well, so that gets their fever up to think about the Messianic Temple. Now, I've shared with our audience before, it's not the Messianic Temple that in the dispensational paradigm, that is the next temple. That is not accurate. And so for all of these people who want to talk about the Messianic Temple being just around the corner, they have absolutely got to realize, if they're not familiar with the actual dispensational teaching, they've got to realize that the actual dispensational teaching is that the so-called proposed next temple is the man of sin temple. Now, we're not going to spend any more time on that. We've spent enough time discussing that. But I want to get back into Isaiah chapter 66 because, as I pointed out before, the word temple itself does not appear in Isaiah 66. But the concept, the irrefutable concept of the Messianic Temple and the, quote, house of the Lord is found in verse 20. Now, the house of the Lord is nothing but, obviously, the temple of the Lord. So, everyone needs to understand that Isaiah 66, although it doesn't use the term or even temple, it most assuredly is talking about the temple. But what we have to see, as we've been sharing as we've gone through this chapter, is the actual context of when this house of the Lord. And William, I want you to be thinking about offering some comments here. Our dispensational friends tell us, and we'll have this discussion as we proceed along in this evening's program, but, pardon me, our dispensational friends tell us, well, in the Messianic Temple, sacrifices are going to be offered, the Jewish feast days are going to be offered, the ceremonial aspects of the Messianic Temple are all going to be there because, after all, Isaiah chapter 66 talks about observing the Sabbath. It talks about observing the new moon festivals, etc. So I want you to be thinking here in just a little bit of giving us some thoughts on what is involved here when it talks about observing the Sabbath, observing the new moon festivals, and what have you. But in the meantime, while you're giving that some thought, I want us to give some thought once again to the context of this entire chapter. The context of this entire chapter is the destruction of the old covenant temple and the judgment of Israel. The Lord said in verse 3 and following, as he projected to the time of the first century, and I know that, remember, because Paul quotes from Isaiah 66 and applies it to his generation. So there can really be no dispute about that. But also the Lord said that what they dread, I will choose their delusions and I will bring their fears upon them. And so this is a very clear prediction of a time coming in which Israel's worst fears would be realized. And then in verse 6, a voice of noise from the city, a voice from the temple, a voice of the Lord that renders recompense to his enemies. Now, you pointed out for us a couple of weeks ago that this is a direct echo of Deuteronomy chapter 32, 34 and following, about how in Israel's last days the Lord would recompense his enemies. The Lord will judge his enemies and repay them. So here is this prediction of Israel's last days. Now, as we go on, I want to skip down to verse 15. For behold, the Lord will come with fire, and with his chariots, like a whirlwind, to render his anger with fury, and his rebuke with flames of fire. For by fire and by his sword will the Lord plead with all flesh, and the slain of the Lord will be many. You know, William, years and years and years ago, I don't even remember exactly how long ago it was, but it's been a lot of years. I was reading this text, and all of a sudden, I realized, wait a minute. Paul quotes from this very verse in 2 Thessalonians chapter 1. Paul writing to the Thessalonians, being persecuted by the Jews, said, it is a righteous thing with God to repay with tribulation those who are troubling you, and to give to you who are troubled relief when the Lord Jesus is revealed from heaven in flaming fire, taking vengeance on those that know not God and that do not obey. And I started grabbing the commentaries, and as I examined these one critical commentary after another, especially the commentaries that take note of the New Testament quotation of Old Testament prophecies. I don't know why I had not seen it up to that point, but for some reason up to that point, I had not noticed all of these critical commentaries that just said in 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, Paul is quoting directly from Isaiah 66 and verse 15. And this was one of those, shall we say, rather stunning moments, one of those epiphany moments in which you go, oh my goodness. If Isaiah 66 is a pretty clear prediction of the first century destruction of Jerusalem, and if Paul quotes from it in 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, then what is our hermeneutical principle for say that Paul was talking about something entirely different from what Isaiah was predicting? Isaiah 66, AD 70. Paul, 2 Thessalonians chapter 1. Well, let's see. What was Paul predicting? Well, before we get into this, I've got to share something that to me is absolutely hilarious. Pardon me. It's more than ironic. William, you know as well as I do that the opponents of covenant eschatology, they're constantly appealing to the patristic writers. They're constantly telling us, we have to listen to the patristic writers. Well, here's what's different. Eusebius, 4th century church historian. Matter of fact, he is sometimes called the father of church history. Well, what does Eusebius tell us? Eusebius tells us that one may literally say that the Lord came in flaming fire and in or with his chariots when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem in AD 70. Well, this becomes really, really fascinating, does it not? Because that means that Paul is quoting it from a passage that even patristic writers recognized predicted AD 70. So once again, here we have this irony. Our opponents say, oh, you got to listen to the patristics now, but Paul is supposedly predicting the second coming. So if Paul is predicting the second coming, But he is drawing on a text that, number one, the text itself most assuredly does predict AD 70, and number two, even some of the most prominent patristic writers said it referred to AD 70. Then how do our opponents say that Isaiah 66:15 is not the second coming to be fulfilled in AD 70? How in the world do they say, well, Paul's quoting the second, Paul's predicting the second coming, and yes, he quotes from Isaiah 66, which is AD 70, but Paul's using it differently. Really? Isn't it valid to ask, where's the proof? Certainly seems like a valid question to me. And yet it's so interesting. Just the other day on Facebook and on YouTube, I made some of these observations. And I was told Eusebius didn't say the second coming was in AD 70. Well, I never claimed that. I never claimed that at all. I simply gave the quotation from Eusebius that the Lord came in flaming fire in AD 70. I simply made the observation that Paul the Apostle applied that same passage to the coming of the Lord and judgment of the Jews for persecuting the Thessalonians. That's what I said. I never said that Eusebius was a full preterist. But that's illustrative of how desperate the opponents of covenant eschatology get. They want to completely deflect away from what the text says and set up a straw man argument that we did not make. We did not say Eusebius said the second coming was in AD 70. I never said that by any stretch of the imagination. I know that Eusebius was actually a futurist, although he certainly had all of these preteristic statements found in him. And so, again, our opponents seem to think that they can make any kind of deflective strawman argument and it destroys the point that is being made. Well, once again, the point is this. Paul in 2 Thessalonians chapter 1 was most assuredly predicting the, quote, second coming, unquote. And he quotes from Isaiah 66. Now, either Paul was misquoting or misapplying Isaiah 66, or Isaiah 66 was predicting the second coming. But if Isaiah 66 was predicting the second coming, that means Isaiah 66 was predicting the second coming in AD 70. And of course, that's what Paul was predicting. Because, once again, Paul was predicting the coming of the Lord in flaming fire to take vengeance on the Jews who were persecuting the Thessalonian Christians at that time. He was coming to take vengeance on those, quote, who are troubling you. Another person on Facebook, this was absolutely hilarious, and once again, it just absolutely illustrates how desperate these guys go or get. This one individual said, persecution against the church did not end in AD 70. The Roman persecution did not stop until the time of Trajan. Well, guess what? As I pointed out to this individual, Paul's not talking about just any persecution. And he's not talking about Roman persecution, because guess what? The Romans were not persecuting the Thessalonians when Paul wrote and said, it is a righteous thing with God to repay with tribulation those who are troubling you. Here's a fact of history, folks. Paul wrote Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians, in approximately 51, some say as late as 53. Well, guess what? The Romans were not persecuting the Thessalonians. The Romans did not begin persecuting the Christians until approximately 64 a full decade after Paul wrote and spoke of those, quote, who are troubling you, unquote, who were persecuting the Thessalonians at that time. Paul didn't say it's a righteous thing with God to repay with tribulation those who will one day begin persecuting you. It's not what he said. He said those who are troubling you. So the coming of the Lord in 2 Thessalonians chapter 1 had to be the coming of the Lord against those who were at that very time actively persecuting the Thessalonian Christians who were living and breathing human beings at that time. Now, I wrote a little book on this entitled In Flaming Fire. And it came as almost a shock to me. I was extremely well pleased. But it almost came as a shock to me. A couple of years after I wrote that little book, I heard from a gentleman in New York who was teaching a college class on hermeneutic. And he said, I thought you might want to know that I'm using your little book on In Flaming Fire as a textbook on hermeneutic. He said, I've never seen a more powerful, although succinct, but I've never seen a more powerful book on proper hermeneutic in all of my life. And he said, I teach directly from your book. And he said, by the way, it's having a profound impact. And I've heard similar stories like that, ever since then. So, folks, let me encourage you. Go to my website, donkpreston.com or BibleProphecy.com, and go to the store and purchase a copy of In Flaming Fire. I can almost guarantee you that it will blow you away. And I have used the argumentation from that book in several formal debates. And I can tell you this, I have never had a debate opponent give any kind of a substantive response. I used the material in this book in my debate with David Hester. I used PowerPoint presentations. William was there. William was my moderator. He knows exactly what I'm talking about. When I was through with my presentation, David Hester got up and said, so I guess Don Preston believes there's no future judgment of anyone for any reason. And I'm going, talk about an evasive response. I didn't say that. Now, I don't believe in a future day of the Lord. If that's what he meant, then he was right, but that's not what he meant. What he meant was nobody will be judged for anything that they do, no matter what they do. It was just a purely evasive, sarcastic response that had no substance at all. It did not answer the question, was it the Thessalonians 2,000 years ago being persecuted? Well, obviously, the answer to that is yes. It did not answer the question, was it the Jews who were persecuting the Thessalonians at that time? Well, the answer is undeniable. All you got to do is read 1 Thessalonians 2, 14 to 16, and Acts chapter 17. It was the Jews. It answers the question, what did Paul promise those suffering, persecuted Thessalonians 2,000 years ago? And the unequivocal, the undeniable, the irrefutable fact is he promised them relief from that persecution. The word that is translated as rest in the good old King James and New King James is from the Greek word onesis, and it means relief from pressure. And in the context, the only pressure is the pressure of persecution. So Paul was promising those first century Christians relief from that persecution at the coming of the Lord. So here is Paul quoting from Isaiah. Isaiah 66, the day of the Lord, the day when the Lord would come in flaming fire. By the way, folks, let's not forget, this is 2 Peter chapter 3 as well. This is the day of the Lord in which the earth and the elements that are in shall be, quote, burned up. This is the coming of the Lord in flaming fire. So when we examine these texts that reference fire in regard to the day of the Lord, then guess what we find? To a great extent, we find that Isaiah lies at the foundation of them, lies at the core of them. And since Isaiah 66 is clearly a prophecy of AD 70, that means that these New Testament texts, which are drawing on Isaiah 66, are likewise reiterations of the prophecy of the destruction of Jerusalem, the Lord's coming in AD 70. Well, William, I've done nothing but talk there. Why don't you chime in and offer us a few of your insights into this?
Well, I mean, you're covering everything quite well. I think that's very good points in terms of these events taking place with 87. One of the points that I noticed also when you were talking about Isaiah 66 and verse 15 was the connection between verses 15 and 60. Well, particularly 15 is one you mentioned, but that verse in connection with verse 6. So as you look at 14 and 15, when you see this, your heart shall rejoice and your bones shall flourish like grass. The hand of the Lord shall be known to his servants, and his indignation to his enemies. Again, we're talking about that vengeance upon the enemies, as you reiterated before from 2 Thessalonians 1. But then he says, "For behold, the Lord will come with fire, with his chariots like a whirlwind, to render his anger with fury and his rebuke with flames of fire," etc. And then you correlate that with verse 6, the sound of the noise from the city, a voice from the temple, the voice of the Lord who fully repays his enemies. So there you have two texts right in the same chapter, in the same context. And we know that the one is drawn from Deuteronomy 32, that represents and refers to, rather, the last days of Israel. This is about God repaying his enemies. You have, as you were just stating, taking vengeance on them that know not God, etc., from the standpoint of repaying with tribulation those who trouble you, etc. And this context, or this verse in 15, and the Lord coming with flaming fire. So I think that is a powerful tie-in to the text in Thessalonians, confirming that it is the time of the destruction of the temple. And when you put all of that together in the context of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, together with those upon whom the wrath was coming, the time frame, the temple, I mean, it's almost just, it's like airtight. You can't get around the context for this taking place in the time of that persecution, in the time of the vengeance being meted out to them, all in association with the temple that was being destroyed, and this language of the Lord coming in his chariots with fire, etc. I mean, what else do they need in order to see this? Because there you have the Old Testament background and foundation for the text in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, particularly in 2nd Thessalonians in terms of taking vengeance.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. That those connections are just so, well, to use your term, so airtight. I mean, how in the world would one go about separating and divorcing verse 6 from verse 15 in any way? I mean, and especially, by the way, when a person realizes and honors the use of the connective particles. Notice that as you go down through the text, how you have verse 12 beginning with for, and verse 14, and when you see this, which goes back to the antecedent, and verse 15 begins with for. And so, like I said, a person cannot exegetically, logically, honestly, you simply cannot go through here and chop and slice and dice and say, okay, this verse okay, this may be talking about AD 70, but this verse over here, that's got to be talking about the end of time. I mean, I was reminded just the other day, William, that this was so amazing to me. I was going through, obviously, the Olivet Discourse, and I happened to remember Burton Kaufman. And if you remember in his commentary, Burton Kaufman said that in the Olivet Discourse, Jesus purposely made his discourse difficult to understand so that his apostles would not understand his doctrine of eschatology. Now, I remember reading Burton Kaufman on that years ago and thinking, okay, so we're supposed to believe that Jesus wanted to purposely confuse his apostles on the subject of eschatology. I mean, it's just literally unbelievable. I mean that in the truest sense. It's unbelievable. And especially in light of the fact that in Matthew chapter 13, okay? In Matthew chapter 13, verses 13 and following, actually verses 16 and following, we are told that Jesus told the parables. And his apostles asked him why he taught in parables. And he told them that he taught in parables so that they could understand the mysteries of the kingdom of God. So here is Jesus telling his apostles that he was telling them the parables. So, and by the way, the parables that are in view there are the parables on eschatology. So here is Jesus telling the parables about eschatology, telling the apostles that he's telling them those parables so that they could understand. And then we got Burton Kaufman on Matthew chapter 24 saying that Jesus purposely mixed up his discussion in the Olivet Discourse, saying, well, in this verse you've got AD 70. In this verse you've got end of the world. In this verse you've got both AD 70 and the end of the world. And Jesus did that in order to keep the apostles confused about the doctrine of the last things. I mean, I guess that illustrates in a really, really powerful way, William, what you and I have seen so often in the fellowship in which we were raised to a certain extent, and that is that eschatology has been so ignored. Eschatology has been simply not studied to such a degree that prominent ministers, and the writer of that commentary, again, folks, is a man by the name of Burton Kaufman. He passed away just recently at over 100 years of age. Very prominent within the churches of Christ. Did a lot of good work in those commentaries. And yet at the same time, eschatology was such a mystery to him that he was actually willing to say that Jesus willfully and purposely confused his apostles about eschatology. I mean, if that's not stunning, I don't know what is. I don't know what else a person would have to say something truly stunning. Because that's just bad. I thought Jesus came to instruct and to enlighten and to teach. But instead, according to some people, he came to obfuscate and to cloud and to shroud the truth in even greater mystery. It's just absolutely amazing. Okay, So we have here Paul drawing on Isaiah 66. Now keep in mind that the Lord said that all of this was going to come on them because he had called and they did not answer, which is a direct recitation of Isaiah 65, 1 and 2. Okay? So, here is Paul drawing on Isaiah 65, drawing on Isaiah 66, and applying these verses to events happening in the first century. Now, I don't know how to say this in any more powerful of a way, folks, but it is impossible to overemphasize the importance of this, of how Paul the Apostle is applying Isaiah 65 and Isaiah 66 to his generation. I mean, he doesn't say, well, as it was back then, so it is now. No, he just draws on Isaiah 65 and Isaiah 66. Now, here's the coming of the Lord in Isaiah 66, 15, and 16. The time of the recompense of his enemies. And then he goes, and for time's sake, and what time is it? Okay, we don't have a lot of time left for this evening. He said, we'll start with verse 18. I know their works and their thoughts. It shall come that I will gather all nations and tongues, and they shall come and see my glory. Here is a precursor to the idea that at the day of the Lord, as a result of the day of the Lord, the nations would come to know the Lord. And verse 19. Now remember, folks, this is after the day of the Lord. And we're certainly not through yet by any means. But anyway, verse 19. I will set a sign among them, and I will send those, watch this, this is incredible. I will send those that escape of them unto the nations, to Tarshish, Pul, Lud, that draw the bow, to Tubal, Javan, to the isles afar off, that have not heard my fame, neither have seen my glory. They shall declare my glory among the Gentiles. William, what is this sign here?
I will set a sign among them, and those who,
yes.
Those among them who escape I will send to the nations. Well, let's see. What is the sign among them? I can't say, Don, that I have that readily that I can recall in terms of, but I would think that it's more like the gospel as far as I would understand it.
Okay, all right. Well, I have generally, let me share with you what I have generally seen this as, as reference to. But back in Isaiah chapter 11, and I'll start with verse 10 in order to reduce the time factor here. Verse 10, in that day, and this is the day of the Messiah, there shall be a root of Jesse, which shall stand for an ensign of the people. To it shall the Gentiles seek, and his rest shall be glorious. Now, ensign and sign are two different words, but they do signify the same concept. And by the way, let me point out something that's very, very significant. Here is Isaiah 11 saying, I'm going to set up an ensign. The idea is there's going to be this banner, so to speak. And I don't know that that's the greatest translation, but I'll use that term. And I'm going to set it there, and it will be for the nations to see and for the nations to come to that banner and be saved. Now, Paul, in Romans chapter 15, as he addresses the Jew and Gentile strife in the church at Rome, told them that they need to strive to work to get along with one another. to bear the infirmities of the weak, not to please themselves, but to be sensitive to their fellow brothers and sisters in Christ. He said, let every one of us please his brother, his neighbor, for his own good. And then, again, for time's sake, he says, verse 7, therefore receive one another, even as God, for Christ's sake, has received us, to the glory of God. Now, I say that Jesus Christ was a minister of the circumcision for the truth of God, to confirm the promises made to the fathers, and that the Gentiles might glorify God for his mercy, as it is written, for this cause I will confess thee to thee among the Gentiles, sing unto thy name. And again he says, rejoice, you Gentiles, with his people. And again, praise the Lord, all you Gentiles, laud him, all you people. And again, Isaiah says, there shall be a root of Jesse, he shall rise to reign over the Gentiles, in him shall the Gentiles trust. Now, here is Paul quoting from this passage, from this context about the raising of the ensign for the calling and the salvation of the Gentiles. And he applies it once again. Okay, go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to ask that, in view of that, the text that came to my mind was Luke 2 and verse 34.
Yes.
So would that also be a part of what you are developing?
Oh, I think it is. I don't see that there's a dichotomy between that. Let me for our audience here, Luke 2:34. Here we have, pardon me, Simeon takes the child, and he says, he said unto Mary his mother, behold, this child is set for the fall and rising again of many in Israel, and which shall be spoken against. Well, that's a direct citation of Isaiah chapter 8, of course. And in that passage, that sign would also be the rock that would be rejected. But that rock would be for the salvation of some and the condemnation of others. And so, and I don't think there's I don't think there's a dichotomy here between these passages. This sign of Isaiah 11, this sign of Isaiah chapter 66 would be most assuredly either for salvation or for condemnation, depending upon whether a person accepted or rejected it. And that's how we have to view these things. This gets back to what we have discussed on this program at different times in the past, and that is that far too many people, Thomas Ice is a classic example. Thomas Ice has been on record. The fatal fallacy of preterism is that they just simply see the judgment of Israel at the coming of the Lord. And he said, when in fact, according to Scripture, Israel is saved at the coming of the Lord. Well, the point of fact is, folks, both are true. It's not a paradox, and it's not a contradiction. It is true that at the coming of the Lord, the remnant would be saved, but the body, the large majority of the body, would be destroyed. That's just biblical fact. And again, let me reiterate, this is not a paradox. This is not a contradiction. This is not a problem. It is just simply that some passages look at the positive aspect of it, i.e. the salvation of the remnant. Some passages, Isaiah 66, verse 6, verse 15 and 16, are looking at it from the negative perspective and emphasizing that particular aspect. And so we have to avoid being monolithic and focused on one single aspect to the exclusion of other aspects. Because very, very often it is not either or, it is both. We just have to be holistic in our approach to the Scriptures. We have to take all of the evidence together. I was having a conversation just last week with a person who was asking me, do you believe that you are saved by faith only? I said, well, we have to use the word faith in the biblical definition. Biblically, faith is not simply mental assent. It's not even sincere mental assent. It's not simply emotional, mental assent. Biblically, true faith is obedience. That's how true faith is known. That's how true faith is manifested. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was an incredible theologian. He lived in Germany at the rise of the Nazi Party, and he saw the abuses of the Nazi Party begin to play out, and the abuse of the Jews. And he said, when they came for this group of people, I kept silent. When they came for that group of people, I kept silent. When they came for this group of people over here, I kept silent. And finally, they came for me. And I cried out. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer came to the realization, and he said, those who believe obey. Those who do not obey do not believe. Well, that's as biblical as it can be. I mean, you literally could not get any more biblical than that. If you don't obey, you don't believe. Pure and simple. That's just Bible doctrine. And yet, so many of our religious neighbors and friends, they want to latch on to the word faith and say, oh, see, that's all that's necessary. Well, what is faith in that text? Faith in that text may be discussing the entire plan of salvation, to use that terminology. Sometimes I don't like that term, but because it sounds too legalistic. But nonetheless, there are things that the Lord expects of us by faith. Just as we cannot focus on one word, one element, one tenet, and say this is all that's required, just so we cannot go to biblical eschatology, and we can't, pardon me, we cannot say, well, this passage over here, all it talks about is salvation of Israel at the day of the Lord, or salvation of the Gentiles at the day of the Lord. That's not judgment. That's not judgment at all. Well, we're not taking a holistic approach. We are becoming monolithic. We are focused with respect to the exclusion of others, and that is not proper hermeneutic. So I hope that little bit of hermeneutical digression there is helpful, but pardon me, but it's so incredibly important. Now, back to the specific text, and oh boy, we're just almost out of time here. So this ensign, the reason I brought that up is the ensign would be both for salvation and for judgment. You know, the brass serpent, William, was set up in the midst of Israel so that those who had been bitten, if they went and looked on it, they were saved. If they refused to look on it, if they didn't believe, in other words, if they didn't believe enough to go to the center of the camp and look at the brass serpent, they were not healed of that serpent's bite. That's illustrating what I mean, and that gets to the issue here of this ensign. That's what I mean by the ensign being set up. I hope I clarified that a little bit.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that was.
Well,
yeah, very good.
Okay. I believe, folks, that we're just about out of time. We may have, I don't know, we may have 20, 30 seconds left here. Listen, I want to remind everyone of Preterist Pilgrim Weekend coming up in July. each of our speakers are to be producing their 2 lessons on video, and we're going to have a special website. It's already set up. We're going to have a special book table where we're going to offer our regular seminar discounts with free shipping when you order, X amount of books. And so we're going to have a Preterist Pilgrim weekend. It's just that everyone won't travel to Ardmore, Oklahoma. Hopefully next year this will not be the case and everyone can come back together, but we're going to do the very best that we can. In the meantime, thank you so much for joining us here on Two Guys in a Bible on Fulfilled Radio, a voice you can trust. William, always great to be with you. With that, I will say good night and God bless.
Thank you for joining the Two Guys in a Bible radio broadcast. On behalf of Don Preston and myself, we'd like to say have a very pleasant day and may God bless. Until next time, we'll see you on Fulfill Radio, a voice you can trust.